You mentioned in your talk about the significance of the resurrection. Could you possibly tell us a little about the impact that the resurrection's had on your life? Obviously, if it's true,
Sure.
it changes everything.
Sure.
Could you explain that?
I was not raised in a Christian home or even a church-going family. I became a Christian late in my teenage years. And as a non-believer, I knew the darkness and the despair that I later learned existentialist philosophers experienced and wrote about. The despair and meaninglessness of a life doomed to end in death. That I, who seems so real and alive today, would someday no longer be. That I would cease to exist. And the thought just overwhelmed me. The idea that I would no longer exist, that my life was doomed to end in death, and this put a question mark behind everything that I did. Everything to me seemed, in light of my own impending non-existence, to be meaningless. And I realized as well that it wasn't just I who would die, but the entire human race is doomed in the eventual heat death of the universe. Everything will be darkness, coldness, and barrenness, death. Death is written throughout the structure of the universe. There is no escape or hope on an atheistic worldview. And so I felt deeply this despair and darkness of a life doomed to end in death. And for me, the knowledge of the resurrection brought to me meaning to life and hope, because the resurrection means that Jesus of Nazareth holds the key that unlocks the door to eternal life. Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And he who lives and believes in me shall never die." And this is a proclamation of good news. Many people will say that becoming a Christian filled their lives with joy or peace or love. For me, those things were wonderful too, but the deepest experience I had was the experience of meaning. To wake up every morning and realize that what I did today mattered, that it has eternal significance, and that comes through Jesus' resurrection and his conquering death. It not only means, however, immortality, it also means complete physical and psychological healing. Christ's resurrection body was a prototype of ours. The Christian hope is not of a disembodied existence, a soul that flies away to some ethereal heaven. It is that we will have resurrection bodies in a renewed and transformed creation. And for me, this was deeply meaningful because I bear in my body the weakness of an inherited genetic neuromuscular disease called Charcot-Marie-Tooth syndrome that causes atrophy in the extremities. It's progressive, and this is something I've lived with for most of my life. And the hope that someday to be delivered from this disease is a wonderful hope to which I look forward. Not only that, however, what I have also come to realize is that all of us are psychologically broken as well. I came to realize that my Charcot-Marie-Tooth syndrome not only affected me physically, but it had affected me emotionally as well. That as a kind of compensatory mechanism for my physical weakness, I threw myself into academics because I could succeed in academics. And this gave me a sense of self-worth and a sense of accomplishment, even though I couldn't play sports or do the things that the other guys did. And that gave me then a kind of goal-oriented A-type personality that can be very negative in certain ways and filled with a kind of deep insecurity. And coming to understand myself more and realize that the resurrection of Jesus means not only physical healing, but complete emotional and psychological healing was wonderful as well. And then, of course, spiritual healing as we're freed from all our guilt and sin and evil, the selfishness that one senses in one's own heart. There's just tremendous, tremendous personal significance, I think, in the subject we've talked about tonight. Now, I've approached it this evening historically, in a sort of disinterested manner. But if this is true, then it is anything but disinteresting. This is vitally, vitally important, and I think life-transforming. It's changed my life. Thank you.
Can we do a quick written one here? With these big issues that you've just been talking about, with all their implications, there are also lots of questions that are small, niggling ones, particularly contradictions in the text.
Yeah.
So this question says that you talked from Corinthians about the 12, he appeared to the 12, but Luke and John say he appeared to the 11. What do you do with that one?
Yes. Remember in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. However, in John's Gospel, Thomas wasn't with the 12 in the upper room when Jesus appeared to them. Is this problematic? Well, even if it were, that wouldn't undermine the fundamental historical fact on which my case was predicated, that different individuals and groups, however many there might have been in the group, did experience appearances of Jesus. But in this case, at least, I don't think there's any discrepancy whatsoever. The 12 here is clearly a title. It's like in the United States we have things like the Big Ten, which is a certain league of universities that compete in sports together. And it doesn't matter whether there's 10 universities in it or not. That's the title of the group. Judas Iscariot was dead by this time, right? So he was one of the 12. He wasn't there. The 12 should have a kind of capital letter. It just means the original group of disciples, even though when Jesus appeared to them in the upper room, in fact, Thomas wasn't there. So I don't think that that's really a serious discrepancy.
Hi, firstly, thank you for all the amazing work you do. I really appreciate it. I know lots of others do. And thank you so much for this evening. I wonder if you can help me with, on fact 2, the story is simple and lacks signs of legendary embellishment. Towards the end of Matthew's Gospel, the tombs are split open,
yes.
the dead are raised, the spirits of holy men are raised, and they go into the city of Jerusalem. That very is arguably a kind of a legendary embellishment, or certainly most people off the street would look at that and say, well, that looks like a legendary embellishment. How would you...
I'm talking about the Markan account.
Right.
Very simply. I'm talking about Mark's account. Mark's account is the earliest of the 4 Gospels, and it's based on this pre-Markan Passion story, and it's that account that I'm talking about when I say it's stark in its simplicity. You don't find these kind of motifs like you do in Matthew, particularly the guard story, even, that's not there. So even if you think that later gospel writers have embellished the narrative, it doesn't contradict the point that I'm making, that our most primitive sources look like they're very simple, factual accounts that are, in fact, free of precisely the sort of coloring that you mentioned. Remember, I'm not treating these documents as wholly inspired books, so we're not concerned about niggling contradictions and inconsistencies. We're looking at them just as historical records. And the historian would be very impressed that the most primitive sources we have are so simple and unembellished.
Accepting that then, could you comment on the Matthew text? I mean, I'll come into this,
right.
But yeah, this question does get asked.
Well, it's interesting that it's not connected with the empty tomb narrative or even the resurrection narrative. The story he's talking about is where in Matthew, when Christ dies on the cross, Matthew says the veil of the temple was rent, there was an earthquake, and the tombs were opened, and certain Old Testament figures, saints of old, came out of the tomb and went into the city and appeared to people. It's very strange. This is the only reference in the New Testament we have to this. And I think it's an open question whether Matthew is simply using here apocalyptic imagery, such as you have in the book of Revelation, for example, or in Jesus' Olivet discourse about the signs of the end times, when he says the stars will be falling from heaven, and other signs of this sort. This is very typical apocalyptic imagery in Jewish literature, and it may not be that Matthew intends this to be literal at all. On the other hand, it could be that he does intend it to be literal. I have an open mind about that, and I'm ready to be convinced either way. I don't have an axe to grind.
And just one more thing on that. Would it be possible that Matthew is just reporting what he has heard? Would that be
Yeah, that's a possibility as well that I find intriguing, actually, because I wouldn't be at all surprised, frankly, if in the aftermath of these resurrection appearances of Jesus, that others might have visions of Old Testament saints, say, oh, I saw Elijah risen from the dead, or I saw Isaiah, or something. And you can imagine this sort of spreading among certain people in the city where they would have these kinds of experiences. So one shouldn't be too quick to just sort of write these off as apocalyptic imagery. It might be, but on the other hand, it might be reports that Matthew has heard. But these would be, and it's important to understand this, only after and in reaction to these unprecedented appearances of Jesus, which, as I say, are utterly un-Jewish and need to have some kind of an explanation in order to get these appearances of Jesus off the ground in the first place. But that interesting question.
In the little creedal statement that you talked about from 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about Christ dying for our sins according to the Scriptures and was buried. He was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures.
Yes.
Can you tell us about these Old Testament prophecies?
When Paul says he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, scholars have puzzled long over this because there doesn't seem to be anything in the Hebrew Scriptures about rising on the third day. So what is Paul referring to when he says on the third, on the third day according or in accordance with the Scriptures, the Hebrew Bible? Some have suggested Isaiah 6:2, where it says that on the second day God will heal us, on the third day he will raise us up. And that could sound like language of resurrection, and maybe the early Christians were thinking of Hosea 6:2 and interpreting that in light of Jesus' resurrection. But Hosea 6:2 is never appealed to any place else in the New Testament as a proof text or even relevant to the resurrection of Jesus. When you look in the Gospels at the text that Jesus appeals to with respect to the three-day motif in the Hebrew Bible, it's the Jonah story. As Jonah was 3 days in the belly of the whale, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the earth. So that I suspect that it's the Jonah story that the early Christians had in mind when they say Jesus was risen on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. They're thinking of that this is a parallel to Jonah.